For 30 years, I sacrificed everything for my son, Kian. 3 jobs, no retirement, so that he could chase his art in New York. When he called, desperate, begging for his rent, I went to my savings, ready to give him the last of it. But then I found this, a receipt from a 5-star palace in Venice, Italy. He wasn't struggling. He was sunbathing on silk sheets while telling me he'd be evicted. The bill for his weekend vacation? More than my annual salary. I was his bank, his fool. But when I cut him off, he didn't apologize. He did something far worse. He sued me. Before we dive into this story of a mother's heartbreak and eventual triumph, hit the like button and tell me in the comments, have you ever felt betrayed by the person you loved and sacrificed the most for? Your story might be the one that helps someone else heal. Now, let's begin. My hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from a rage that had been slowly simmering for years and now boiled over, scalding me from the inside out. My name is Elodie. I'm 57 years old, and for the last 7 years, I had been an emotional and financial lifeline to a man-child who treated my stability like an endless stream of cash. I had always told myself it was love, that I was simply being a good mother, helping her artist son find his footing. Kian, with his dark, charming eyes and easy smile, was a freelance photographer, a job that he assured me was on the cusp of greatness, but somehow never paid for basic necessities. The truth, however, now lay exposed, brutal and undeniable. He wasn't struggling, he was leeching. This trip wasn't a last-minute creative assignment. It was a lavish, planned vacation. He hadn't called me from his tiny, struggling apartment. He had called me from a gilded suite overlooking the Grand Canal. The sheer audacity, the depth of the deception, hit me like a physical blow. The shame wasn't his. It was mine, for having been so blind, so stupidly loyal. I walked over to the kitchen island, placing the Venetian receipt right next to the thick stack of bills I needed to pay. The house insurance, the new transmission for my aging car, and my own library dues. The contrast was a slap in the face. My life of frugal, anxious necessity against his life of careless, glittering luxury. I remembered the last time he was home for a visit 6 months ago. He'd complained endlessly about the draft in his apartment, the toxic work environment, and how he needed space to breathe to create his art. He'd even guilt-tripped me into giving him my old digital camera, a professional-grade Nikon, saying his equipment was too old. I was so busy worrying about his well-being that I failed to notice the brand-new, expensive leather luggage set he had casually stowed in my garage. I was so focused on being the hero mother that I didn't see the villain he had become. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was a violation of trust, a deep-seated betrayal that poisoned every memory I had of raising him. Every sacrifice, every late night spent sewing clothes or cleaning floors after my official shift to afford a better gift, was now stained with the knowledge that this was the end product. An entitled, globe-trotting liar who saw his mother as nothing more than a bank to defraud. The worst part was the humiliation. I had defended him to my friends, to my former husband Reese, telling everyone Kian was just finding his footing and that a mother's help was unconditional. Now I saw the pity in their eyes, which I had previously dismissed as jealousy, was actually justified. They saw the truth I refused to accept. My son was an emotional thief. I took a shaky breath, the trembling in my hands finally subsiding, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. I picked up my phone and opened my bank's wire transfer app. My fingers hovered over the screen. The old Elodie, the one who lived in fear of her son's disappointment, would have sent the money, then called him, crying, begging for a little more honesty next time, only to be dismissed with a shallow apology and a promise to Pay her back soon. But the new Elodie, the one holding the Venetian receipt like a warrant, was waking up. I deleted the transfer amount. I wasn't just going to stop sending money. I was going to send him a message delivered not in words, but in a silence so loud it would echo across the Grand Canal. I walked to the living room and picked up the phone to call Reese, the man I divorced for being too hard on Kian. It was time to finally tell him the truth, and it was time for Kian's world to finally collapse. Reese answered on the second ring, his voice a low, steady rumble that instantly made me feel both guilty and momentarily safe. "Elodie, everything all right? You sound breathless?" I clutched the phone, the Venetian receipt now tucked securely in my jeans pocket, a small paper shard of evidence. I hadn't called him outside of major holidays or emergencies in over a decade. He lived 2 states away now, a successful engineer who had rebuilt a life of quiet stability, a life Kian had always derided as boring. I swallowed, the knot in my throat tighter than a fist. "No, Reese," I managed, my voice raspy. "Nothing is all right. I need to tell you something about Kian, about everything." I could hear the faint background music of his evening routine. Maybe the news, maybe a jazz record. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. He didn't interrupt, didn't demand to know the emergency. He simply waited. That was Reese, patient, predictable, and fundamentally honest, all the qualities Kian had driven me away from. I began to tell him, starting not with the receipt, but with the first seed of this crippling financial dependency. It wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of my boundaries that began the moment Kian graduated from the prestigious, out-of-state university I had practically bankrupted myself to send him to. I skipped the details of the $30,000 in student loans I took out in my name, something Kian was supposed to pay off with his breakthrough photography career. Instead, I told Reese about the garage sale. Kian was 23, fresh out of college, and insisted on moving straight to New York City to chase his dreams. He needed a starter fund. I remember standing in our driveway on a blistering hot Saturday, sweating through my dress, watching strangers haggle over the lifetime of possessions I had accumulated. His father's old power tools, my grandmother's china, the bicycle Kian used to ride to school. Kian, meanwhile, was inside, working on his portfolio, occasionally emerging to complain about the heat and how embarrassing the whole situation was. That day, I made $4,000. I handed it all to him, teary-eyed, telling him it was his ticket to the big time. Reese let out a long, slow sigh over the phone, the sound carrying a decade of unspoken, "I told you so." But he didn't say the words. He just said, "He was never home for that, was he, Elodie? He just sent you a text thanking you." I closed my eyes, a fresh wave of humiliation washing over me. "He was at a party," I whispered. "A networking event," he called it. He couldn't miss it. I confess that over the past 7 years, the requests had escalated from emergency food money to, "I can't believe my landlord is doing this," to outright demands, all punctuated by glossy photos of Kian in exotic locations that he claimed were just quick layovers or stock photo assignments. He'd send me a picture of himself looking ruggedly handsome on a beach in Thailand and follow it up with a text that read, "Don't forget the rent is due, Mom. Really stressed about it." The emotional whiplash was a tactic, one I was finally ready to name. I admitted that the real reason I called Reese wasn't just to confess, but because Kian had always feared his father's disapproval more than anything. Reese had tried to set firm boundaries when Kian was younger. No allowance without chores, no car until he could pay his insurance, no moving to NYC until he had a year's rent saved. I had always undermined him, seeing his discipline as cruelty and my enabling as unconditional love. That was the real betrayal. I had betrayed Reese by choosing Kian's easy affection over our mutual, necessary strength. I realized now that Kian hadn't loved me. He had simply learned to manipulate my need to be needed. I explained that I finally had proof, the receipt, and I was done. I wasn't going to send the rent money. "And now you want a lifeline," Reese stated, his voice not harsh but factual. "A cavalry to ride in and save you from the fallout." I didn't deny it. "I want you to be the wall," I choked out. "The one he can't climb over? I can't do this alone, Reese. When he calls me from Venice, screaming, 'I know I'll break. I need you to back me up.'" The admission of my own weakness was the hardest thing I'd said all day. The line went silent again. Longer this time. I imagined him running his hand through his graying hair, considering the cost of stepping back into the maelstrom of our family drama. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of the warmth I had initially sought. "You made this bed, Elodie, but he's still my son. Send me a photo of the receipt. I'll call you back in an hour. Don't send him a dime. Not 1 cent. His resolve, though chilling, was exactly the steel I needed. The phone clicked, leaving me alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty, quiet space where Kian's jacket had been. I felt a sliver of hope, a fragile new armor. But underneath, I knew Kian's inevitable, enraged call was just a flight away. And when it came, it would feel like an explosion. The hour Reese had promised stretched into an agonizing eternity. I couldn't sit still. I paced my small house, touching the familiar worn surfaces, the smooth wood of my antique writing desk, the frayed edge of my favorite armchair, objects I now understood I had risked losing for a son who valued them less than a 2-night stay in a foreign hotel. I had sent Reese the photo of the Venetian receipt, the stark white paper with its Italian script and astronomical numbers glowing accusingly on his screen. Every time my phone vibrated, my heart leaped, expecting his call. But it was just a notification, a marketing email. A message from my colleague at the library. The waiting was its own form of torture, a psychological space where all my failures as a mother came home to roost. I replayed every conversation, every desperate plea, every moment I had chosen to be Kian's savior instead of his guide. I realized I hadn't been helping him. I had been stunt-growing his entitlement, watering his narcissism with my own hard-earned money and endless pity. Finally, the phone rang, the bright, insistent tone cutting through the silence of my home. It was Reese. I snatched it up. "Reese?" I asked, my voice tight. "I'm looking at it," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's a lovely hotel, 5 stars. I see the charge for the private water taxi, too." He didn't miss a thing. His measured tone was more damning than any scream. I could almost hear the grinding of his teeth. "What do we do?" I whispered, needing to hear a plan, a strategy to dismantle the house of cards Kian had built on my back. Reese didn't offer a gentle approach. He was all brutal efficiency. "You don't do a thing, Elodie. You let the wire transfer window expire. You let the silence sit. He expects a panicked, tearful mother to rush in and fix everything. We're giving him the opposite, a black hole of zero reaction. He's a manipulator. He only understands consequence." He explained his plan. He would not call Kian, not text him, not give him the satisfaction of knowing we were communicating. My silence would be absolute. His silence would be a cold, invisible wall. The consequence was the looming eviction. "It's going to hurt, Elodie, for him and for you. He's going to call you every name under the sun. He's going to tell you you're ruining his life, that you're an awful mother, that this one mistake," he spat the word mistake, "is going to destroy his career. You have to hold the line." You have to say nothing, do nothing. Just listen to his anger, and when he's done, you hang up, and you don't send the money. The finality in his voice was terrifying, yet exhilarating. I was trading my comfort for my dignity. I was trading Kian's good mood for my financial security. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, but at least I wasn't sinking anymore. I agreed, the word catching in my throat, a small, barely audible sound. We spent the next half hour going over the logistics. Reese confirmed he had quietly transferred the money he had saved for Kian's eventual needs, money he had put aside for his son's future, into a separate, untouchable account under my name. That's your money now, Elodie, not his. It's for you to get out of the hole he dug. The gesture of silent support, the unsaid recognition of my financial abuse, was more healing than any apology he could have offered for our divorce. He was protecting me, not by fighting Kian, but by empowering me. He reminded me of the time Kian, as a child, had deliberately broken a priceless vase to see if I would still love him, and I had hugged him and bought him ice cream. Reese had been furious then, calling it reinforcing bad behavior. Now, I finally saw his wisdom. The sun began to set, painting my kitchen in a soft, sad orange glow. The deadline for Kian's rent wire transfer was only hours away. The phone remained silent. No panicked follow-up from him. No check-in. Just the expectant, entitled calm of a man who assumed his mother was already solving his latest crisis. I knew he was probably enjoying a final carefree dinner in Venice, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine that was about to drop. I felt a surge of cold fury, a powerful protective instinct that was finally aimed in the right direction, protecting myself. I walked over to the refrigerator and took down the small, framed photo of Kian that had always hung there, a picture of him at age 10, beaming after winning a Little League game. I turned it around to face the wall. The game had begun, and this time, I wasn't playing by Kian's rules. The call came precisely at 4:30 a.m. my time, the jarring ringtone an ugly intrusion into the deepest part of my sleep. I fumbled for the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs, a sudden, sick surge of adrenaline flooding my body. The screen flashed. Kian, Venice, a surreal headline of my impending doom. I took a deep breath, remembering Reese's calm, stern instructions. Hold the line, say nothing, do nothing, I answered. His voice was not the panicked, tearful sound he usually used to beg for money. It was a furious, controlled thunder, a tone I had rarely heard, reserved only for when his absolute control over a situation had been challenged. Mom, what the hell is going on? My landlord just called me. The payment hasn't gone through. Did you forget? I told you it was urgent. I remained silent, listening to the static of the overseas connection and the undercurrent of noise. Was that the sound of a speedboat? I didn't confirm or deny anything. I let the silence be my weapon. Kian's voice instantly ratcheted up, his panic now real, his veneer of smooth traveler cracking like thin ice. Mom, are you there? Don't hang up. I'm going to be locked out of my apartment, Mom. Everything I own is there. Do you have any idea what this means for my career? I can't get back to New York without a place to stay. I just need you to press send. Did the bank block it? Tell me what the problem is. He sounded genuinely distraught, but not because he was worried about me, the person who was supposed to be fixing his mess. His distress was entirely self-centered, a realization that was like a fresh, painful tear in my already wounded heart. The sheer lack of concern for the actual banking error he had claimed, the complete absence of a question like, "Are you okay, Mom?" was the final confirmation I needed. I heard him take a sharp, ragged breath, and the manipulation shifted from panicked victim to raging accuser. You know, this is typical, Mom, always dropping the ball at the last minute. I'm out here trying to build a career, trying to make you proud, and you can't handle one simple wire transfer. This is what happens when you rely on people. You know I'm good for it. I'm getting a huge commission next month. Didn't you get my email?" His voice was now pure venom. The years of pent-up entitlement, of believing he was the golden child for whom rules and responsibilities didn't apply, were pouring out. I felt a cold calm settle over me. I wanted to tell him about the Venetian receipt, to shove the evidence of his betrayal down his entitled throat, but Reese's instruction echoed. Silence. I needed to let him fully expose himself. He went on for 5 solid minutes, a torrent of abuse and guilt-tripping. He called me incompetent, forgetful, and finally, cruelly, a selfish mother who just wants to see her son fail so she can feel important. That last phrase, selfish mother, was the final stake driven into the coffin of my illusion. I hadn't been selfish. I had been a martyr. I had neglected my own health, my own needs, my own dreams, all to prop up his fantasy. And this was my reward. When he finally paused, his voice hoarse from shouting, I still said nothing. I only waited, the clock in my kitchen ticking loudly, marking the seconds of his downfall. He seemed to realize the lack of verbal panic on my end was more terrifying than any fight. "Mom, did you hear me?" he asked, his voice now dangerously soft, a chilling new tactic. "If I don't get that money in the next hour, I'm going to be on the street. I swear, I'll never forgive you for this." "You're destroying my life, Mom. My entire life." It was the ultimate theatrical climax of his act. The threat of never forgiving me, the very thing that had driven my enabling for years. It was the moment of truth. I felt the familiar pull of my old self, the rush to save him, to smooth the waters, to send the money just to stop the pain. I squeezed my eyes shut, picturing the gritty palace receipt, the $3,000 for luxury I was supposed to sacrifice my meager savings for. I opened my eyes, and a single word, spoken in a calm, steady voice that sounded foreign even to me, finally left my lips. Good. The line went completely silent. Not static, not the sound of Venice, just a void. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I gently pressed the red end call button. The phone in my hand felt heavy, but my heart felt lighter than it had in a decade. Kian's fury had been my final, necessary piece of evidence, confirming that my choice was not cruel, but a long overdue act of self-preservation. The silence that followed was not lonely. It was the sound of a cage door opening. But the emotional fallout was just beginning. Kian was now stranded, penniless, and about to be homeless in New York, and I knew his next call wouldn't just be angry. It would be a desperate, strategic attack. The morning after the terrifying 4:30 a.m. call was spent in a dizzying mix of relief and anxiety. The silence from Kian was absolute, more unnerving than his shouting. He was likely in transit or perhaps busy navigating the immediate fallout in New York. But I knew he was regrouping, preparing for his next move. Reese called me mid-morning, his tone pragmatic and businesslike. "He called me," Reese stated, no preamble needed. "About an hour ago. He said you were having a breakdown and deliberately destroying his life out of spite." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The gaslighting had begun, the immediate attempt to paint me as the crazy villain. "What did you tell him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid of what he might have said to break my resolve. Reese's answer was a masterclass in controlled, surgical confrontation. I told him I'd heard the details of his situation. I told him I wouldn't lend him a cent, and then I told him this. "Kian, I know you were in Venice 2 days ago. I know you paid $3,000 for a hotel suite and a water taxi while your mother was scrambling to pay your rent. I've seen the receipt. You didn't have a banking error, you had a priority error, and your mother and I are no longer your backup plan. This is a consequence of your choices, and you will deal with it." I will not discuss this again until you have secured a roof over your head and a sustainable source of income. Goodbye. I sank onto my sofa, the relief so powerful it made me dizzy. The simple act of saying, "I've seen the receipt," was a shockwave that dismantled Kian's entire defense structure. Reese hadn't just stood as a wall, he had thrown a bomb. "He didn't argue?" I asked, stunned by the clean execution. "He stammered," Reese said, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. He was shocked into silence. He tried to claim it was a business expense, a networking dinner, but he couldn't even sell that lie to himself. He knows he's caught. He knows the jig is up. Reese's cold efficiency was the perfect antidote to Kian's emotional theatrics. He treated Kian's manipulation like a mathematical problem, not a family tragedy. Reese then moved to the next step, the practical side of the breakup. "He's going to be frantic, Elodie. He's going to call your friends, your extended family, anyone he thinks will shame you into submission. We need to get ahead of the narrative. I've already contacted my sister Patricia, who he's always trying to borrow money from." I told her the truth, calmly and factually. "You need to call your two closest friends, Beatrice and Oswald. Just tell them you've stopped sending Kian money and you are not discussing the reasons. Tell them any call they get from him is a lie. That will close off his emergency escape routes." His plan was not just about stopping the money. It was about stripping Kian of his audience, the people who unwittingly fueled his victim complex. The task felt monumental, a terrifying exposure of my family's ugly secret. For years, I had cultivated an image of the loving, long-suffering mother, but now I had to admit the truth. I had raised a financially abusive con artist. Making those calls was harder than facing Kian's anger. When I called Beatrice, I found my voice trembling as I delivered the prepared statement. She listened in silence, and then, her voice full of a gentle, weary pity, she said, "Oh, Elodie, we were so worried about you. You've been carrying him for so long. We'll be your shield. Now, what can we do for you?" Her quiet validation, the confirmation that they had seen the truth all along and had silently worried about me, not Kian, broke my composure. I finally wept, not tears of grief for Kian, but tears of release for myself. Reese and I hung up, his final words a stark warning. "The hardest part is over, Elodie, but he's going to find a way back into your life, even if it's just to hurt you. Don't engage. Focus on yourself. You have to heal now, not just survive." I looked around my quiet house, the house I had saved, and saw it not as a cage of my sacrifices, but as a sanctuary I had defended. I realized the financial debt was minor compared to the emotional debt I owed myself. I was 57, and it was finally time to live my own life. I walked to the kitchen, opened my filing cabinet, and pulled out the old manila envelope labeled "Retirement Dreams." Inside was a faded, half-written travel brochure for a place I had always longed to go, a place Kian had scoffed at as too pedestrian. I smiled. The revenge was already sweet, but the healing would be the real victory. The week that followed felt like a slow-motion car crash. Kian's initial shock wore off, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He didn't call my friends. He went straight for the jugular, my mother's side of the family, particularly my older, highly judgmental cousin, Genevieve, who had always believed I was too soft on my son. Genevieve called me, her voice dripping with self-righteous disappointment. "Elodie, Kian just called me, weeping. He said you've cut him off, that you're watching him become homeless. He said you're keeping money from him that your father left for him. Is this true? You're acting completely unlike yourself." The lie about my father's money was a new low, a deliberate attempt to poison my relationship with the family. I didn't panic. I remembered Reese's strategy: control the narrative. "Genevieve," I said, my voice steady. Kian is 30 years old. He has been financially independent for exactly 0 of those years. I have supported him through 7 years of self-proclaimed financial emergencies, including a 2-night stay at a luxury hotel in Venice this week, which cost over $3,000. I have the receipt. There is no money from my father for him. I am simply choosing to pay my own mortgage instead of his rent. I didn't raise my voice. I simply presented the facts, a cold, hard counter to his theatrical performance. Genevieve's stunned silence was the sound of Kian's manipulation failing. This was the emotional rhythm Reese had warned me about. Kian would escalate, and I would respond with a quiet, factual checkmate. I noticed a distinct pattern in Kian's communications. His first calls were always about the money, urgent, demanding, threatening. When that failed, he'd switch to the guilt, crying, claiming emotional distress, using phrases like, "I've never been more scared," and "I don't know why you hate me so much." When that failed, he'd fall back to the shame, calling me names, trying to trigger my old fear of being a bad mother. But now, for the first time, I was insulated from the pain of his words. They felt less like wounds and more like the desperate flailing of a drowning man who had realized his lifeboat, me, was floating away. I started to see his life for what it was, a meticulously crafted performance. The struggling artist was the role he played for me. The charming world traveler was the role he played for his friends on social media. I pulled up his Instagram, something I'd avoided doing for months. It was a glossy gallery of his assignments, a photo of him looking thoughtful next to an ancient ruin in Peru. A shot of a delicious-looking meal in a Parisian cafe, all carefully curated to suggest a life of creative struggle and adventure. He never posted about the actual struggle, the overdue bills, the reality of sleeping on friends' couches, or the endless demanding calls to his mother. He had built his entire identity on a lie, and the eviction from his NYC apartment was not just a loss of housing, it was the collapse of his entire fraudulent persona. The most shocking realization came from Reese. He had called the landlord's office in New York posing as a family friend and learned Kian hadn't paid rent in 4 months. He had been lying to me, claiming each month was an emergency while I was sending him money to cover the months he'd already squandered. My money was not even for the current month, it was to cover his ancient debt. He had been using my funds to sustain his expensive lifestyle, not his basic needs. The shock of that final betrayal didn't hurt. It made me laugh, a sharp, bitter sound that held no humor. The audacity was almost admirable. That night, I opened a new bank account, one only I knew about. I made a wire transfer for the first time in years, but this one was for me. I booked a non-refundable round-trip ticket to Acadia National Park in Maine, the pedestrian place Kian had scoffed at, a place I had dreamed of seeing since I was a girl. I wasn't just saving my money, I was spending it on my own happiness, an act of radical self-care that felt more like revenge than any shouting match. I looked at the dark, silent phone on my counter. Kian's final, most potent weapon was looming, the desperate, pleading return home. I knew what I had to do next. I needed to empty his sanctuary. The day Kian finally showed up on my doorstep, unannounced, was a masterstroke of cinematic irony. It was a Saturday, a crisp, sunny day, and I was hosting a highly curated, small estate sale on my front lawn. Not a garage sale this time. An estate sale, complete with a professional appraiser who had valued all the items. The items were all of Kian's things he had left behind over the years, the treasures he deemed too heavy or too old to take to New York, but too valuable to truly part with. The centerpiece, the professional-grade Nikon digital camera I had let him take, which I had retrieved from his old closet before he could sell it. Kian emerged from a beat-up rented taxi, looking disheveled, defeated, and furious. His eyes, usually so charming, were bloodshot and blazing. He was wearing the same expensive cashmere jacket I'd pulled the Venetian receipt from. He stopped dead on the curb, staring at the sight. His old baseball trophies laid out on a card table. The box of expensive, unused darkroom chemicals he was going to use one day. And most crucially, his father's vintage, mint-condition Leica camera, which Reese had given him on his 18th birthday and which Kian had casually left behind, claiming it was obsolete. The appraiser had placed a small, numbered tag on the Leica that read, "Asking price, $4,000. He stumbled toward the lawn, ignoring the small crowd of neighbors and strangers browsing. "Mom, what is this?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and absolute horror. "Are you out of your mind? You're selling my life. That's my equipment. That's my stuff." He reached out to grab the Leica, but the appraiser, a calm, imposing man named Mr. Chen, subtly moved closer to the table, blocking him. My voice, when I finally spoke, was calm, gentle, and utterly devoid of warmth. I didn't look away from the small table of glassware I was wiping clean. "It hasn't been your stuff for a long time, Kian," I said, putting the rag down. "You abandoned it. You haven't had a permanent address in 4 months, and you've been evicted from your current one. Your possessions needed a home, and I need the money to pay the $30,000 in student loans you took out in my name and haven't paid a penny on." The truth, delivered simply and publicly, hung in the air. The small crowd, already curious, now looked at Kian with a sudden, judgmental pity. He was furious, trapped, and for the first time, completely powerless. "You can't do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine anguish. "That Leica is priceless. It was Dad's. You're robbing me." He knew the value of the camera, not its sentimental worth, but its market value. "I'm not robbing you, Kian," I replied, finally meeting his gaze, my eyes dry and clear. "I'm recouping my losses. You forfeited your claim to these things when you chose a hotel suite in Venice over responsibility here." I took the Venetian receipt from my pocket and held it up, letting the people on the lawn see the Italian lettering. "This is the true price you paid for your things, Kian. Not the price of rent, but the price of our relationship. Everything here is paying for your choices." He tried to argue, to plead, to cry, but the audience of strangers and the unmoving appraiser held him in check. His shame was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket of humiliation. He had come home to emotionally blackmail me, to sleep on my couch, and to plot his next move. But he found his sanctuary, his quiet place of retreat, turned into a public execution of his financial fraud. He realized that the money from the sale would be gone, paying off the debt he created, and he wouldn't see a cent of it. He finally gave up, not in a storm of rage, but in a defeated slump, his eyes vacant. He sat on the curb, his head in his hands, defeated and silent. I let him sit there for a long, painful hour while the sale continued around him, the small, transactional sounds of cash registers and happy buyers an insult to his sense of entitlement. When Mr. Chen sold the Leica for the asking price, the sound of the check tearing from the book was a shot in the silence. Kian stood up, his face a mask of cold, hard hatred. "You'll regret this, Mother," he spat, using the formal distancing word. "You've chosen money over your only son. You're alone now." He turned and walked away, disappearing down the street in the direction of the bus station, leaving behind his expensive luggage in the weeds by the curb. I watched him go, not with sadness, but with a profound, aching finality. The only thing I regretted was that it had taken me so long to save myself. The immediate aftermath of Kian's dramatic exit was a period of intense, almost unnerving quiet. The estate sale had been a success, yielding enough to completely pay off a significant chunk of the student loans I had taken out in my name. The weight of that financial burden lifting was palpable, a physical lightening of my shoulders. However, the emotional silence that descended over my house felt heavy and vast. The phone didn't ring. Kian had made good on his parting shot. He had cut me off completely. His social media was dark, his phone number unresponsive. The silence was not the frantic, anxious waiting of the past. It was a cold, deliberate vacuum. He was punishing me by withdrawing his presence, a new form of manipulation designed to make me miss him, to worry, to crack and call him with an apology and a check. And for a time, it almost worked. The solitude, which I had initially craved, began to feel like isolation. I walked through the rooms of my house, seeing the empty spaces where his belongings had been, and memories, once suppressed, flooded back. Not the recent painful ones, but the sweet, innocent fragments. Kian at age 6, reading a picture book to me in that very armchair. Kian's shy excitement when I bought him his first professional camera. The pride I felt watching him walk across the graduation stage. A moment I now realized was tainted by the financial web he was already spinning. I wept, not for the son who had left, but for the son I thought I had raised, the version of him that was now lost forever. The grief was real. A necessary process of mourning the relationship I thought I had. I knew this was the trap. This emotional quiet was designed to break my resolve. "You're alone now," his words echoed. I reached out to Reese, not for rescue, but for perspective. "He's gone silent," I told him. "And I feel like a part of me is missing, like I'm a terrible person for choosing myself." Reese's response was immediate and steady. "He is not missing, Elodie. He is just not performing for you anymore. He's out there, using that handsome face and his quick wit to charm his way into someone else's living room. He's fine. You are not a terrible person. You are a survivor. The silence is his final attempt to control you. It's the highest form of manipulation. Don't let the sound of his absence be louder than the sound of your own voice." His words were a life raft. I decided to fill the silence, not with worry, but with action. I went to the library and put in my notice, finally taking the leap to retire 6 months earlier than I had planned. The financial cushion from the estate sale, combined with Reese's hidden retirement money, meant I could actually do it. It was terrifying. An abrupt severing from the routine that had defined my life, but it was also a vital step toward reclaiming my future. I spent the next few days in a flurry of activity, not allowing myself time to dwell. I went to the thrift store and bought a second-hand telescope, something I had always wanted to do but never allowed myself to splurge on. I started rereading all the classic literature I had only briefly skimmed during my college years. The most important step was unpacking the box I had stored away for years, a box labeled Acadia. Inside were maps, old travel books, and a half-written itinerary for the trip I had dreamed of taking with Reese before our marriage fell apart. A failure I had always blamed, in part, on Kian's constant need for money and attention. I spread the maps out on the dining room table, tracing the winding, coastal routes with my finger. I began to actively plan my solo trip, my act of self-love. I wasn't waiting for Kian's call or Reese's permission. I was actively building a life so beautiful and so centered on my happiness that Kian's manipulative return would be powerless to destroy it. I looked at the dark, silent phone on my desk and whispered a silent challenge to my absent son. "You can be silent, Kian, but you will not stop my life." The silence lasted 3 agonizing months. 3 months of missed birthdays, unanswered emails, and the complete vacuum of Kian's presence. I learned to live with it, to appreciate the quiet, to build a new routine centered on my own desires. I took art classes, volunteered at an animal shelter, and most importantly, spent a week by myself in a small cabin upstate, practicing the solitude I was now living. The pain of the betrayal had finally calcified into a quiet, cold resolve. I had done the work. I had healed. I had financially secured myself, and I was ready to move on. But Kian's final desperate attempt to reclaim his old life and my money was still waiting. It began subtly, an innocuous ping on my phone, a notification from Facebook, a new profile under a fake name had started following me. I was about to dismiss it as spam when I saw the profile picture. A close-up, slightly blurred shot of a familiar, dark-haired man looking pensively out a window. It was Kian. He had been lurking, watching, trying to gauge my emotional state from afar. He was testing the waters before the full frontal assault. I blocked the profile immediately, not giving him the satisfaction of an acknowledgement. But the blockage was a spark that ignited his fury. 2 days later, the real shock hit. I received an email, not from Kian, but from his former landlord in New York. The subject line, urgent, small claims court summons. Kian had filed a lawsuit. He was suing me for $10,000. The claim? He alleged that I had breached an oral contract to provide continuous financial support for his artistic career, and that my malicious and sudden withdrawal of funds was directly responsible for his eviction, the loss of his valuable networking contacts, and severe emotional distress. It was a staggering piece of calculated, cynical entitlement. He hadn't just sued. He had weaponized my motherly love, turning every check I had ever written into evidence of a legal obligation. My hands shook as I called Reese. He was furious, but not surprised. "He's trying to scare you, Elodie," Reese said, his voice hard. "It's the ultimate bluff. He knows he can't win, but he also knows you hate conflict. He wants you to settle out of court, to just pay him a couple of $1,000s to make him go away. It's a final, legal act of extortion." Reese, a successful man with no tolerance for injustice, immediately took charge. "Send me the documents. I'm calling my lawyer friend, Mr. Peterson. We are not settling. We are going to fight this, and we are going to use his own weapon against him." Mr. Peterson, a sharp, no-nonsense man, confirmed Reese's analysis. The lawsuit was frivolous, but it required an aggressive public defense to shut Kian down completely. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequence. We would countersue. Not for money, but for the unpaid portion of the $30,000 student loan I had taken out in my name, the one he had verbally promised to pay. We would present the Venetian receipt, his social media posts, and his 7 years of dependency as evidence of a pattern of financial abuse and calculated fraud. The goal wasn't just to win. It was to publicly expose his entire scam and ensure he would never be able to claim financial support from me again. It was the highest form of justice, using the legal system to deliver the truth. The day I signed the papers to countersue was the day my healing truly began. I wasn't a victim seeking rescue. I was a plaintiff seeking justice. I looked at the legal documents, the formal language making my pain and Kian's betrayal a matter of public record, and I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't known was possible. Kian's lawsuit, his final desperate attempt to hurt me, had inadvertently given me the perfect, public platform for my revenge. He had thought he was cornering me. Instead, he had just led me straight to the battlefield where I was guaranteed to win. The courtroom was sterile and imposing, all dark wood and high ceilings. I sat at a large table with Mr. Peterson, feeling a strange mix of terror and exhilarating clarity. Across the room, Kian sat alone. He had dressed in a cheap suit that didn't quite fit, and his usually vibrant eyes looked sunken and nervous. He didn't look like the confident, globe-trotting artist from his Instagram feed. He looked like a scared, 30-year-old boy about to face the consequences of his lifelong dishonesty. He refused to look at me, his gaze fixed on the judge. Mr. Peterson was a quiet predator. His opening statement, a slow, deliberate dismantling of Kian's entire case. He didn't focus on the emotional claim of breach of contract. He focused on the facts. He presented the canceled checks, the bank statements, the emails that detailed the 7 years of emergency payments. Then, he delivered the kill shot. He formally submitted the Venetian hotel receipt and Kian's flight details as Exhibit A. Your Honor, Mr. Peterson's voice was calm. The plaintiff claims that his mother's malicious withdrawal of funds destroyed his life. We contend that the plaintiff destroyed his own life by using money intended for his basic necessities to fund a luxury vacation. The defendant was not malicious. She was simply choosing to pay her own debts rather than continue subsidizing the plaintiff's champagne lifestyle. We ask that the plaintiff's claim be dismissed, and that we be granted judgment on our countersuit for the $30,000 in unpaid student loans. Kian's face, when he finally stood to represent himself, was a terrifying mask of panic and rage. He tried to claim the receipt was fabricated, a trick, but Mr. Peterson immediately presented the hotel's certified records of Kian's check-in and check-out. Kian then launched into a theatrical, emotional appeal, turning to the judge with tears in his eyes. Your Honor, he pleaded, his voice cracking. My mother is trying to ruin me. She's doing this out of spite because she's lonely. I've always been good for the money. My career was just about to take off. She knows I can't afford a $30,000 payment. She's just trying to tie me down and make me dependent on her again. It was a staggering, final attempt at gaslighting, an accusation that flipped the entire truth on its head. The judge, a stoic woman with a sharp, discerning gaze, silenced him with a tap of her gavel. She then looked directly at me. Mrs. Elodie, she said, her voice clear and measured. Is there anything you wish to say to your son before I rule? This was the moment of ultimate decision, the chance for my final personal revenge. I could yell, I could cry, I could tear him down with every truth I knew, but I didn't. I looked across the room at my son, not with anger, but with a profound, aching pity. He was a hollow man, completely incapable of understanding love outside of transaction. I stood up, adjusting my simple dark jacket. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the years of pain. I have nothing to say to the plaintiff. I only wish to submit this. I gently slid a piece of paper forward. It was a formal, notarized waiver, something Mr. Peterson had drawn up as an option. I wish to waive my claim for the $30,000 in student loans. I am not seeking money from my son. I am only seeking a legal order to ensure that he is never again allowed to financially contact me, my ex-husband, or any member of our immediate family under any pretense for the rest of our lives. I do not want his money. I want my freedom. A gasp ran through the small, nearly empty courtroom. Kian's jaw dropped. I had denied him the victim status of having an enormous debt to hold over my head, and I had used the court not for monetary gain, but for emotional and legal self-defense. The judge's eyes softened slightly. She cleared her throat and then, with a heavy finality, delivered her ruling. Plaintiff Kian's claim is dismissed with prejudice, and finding the request by the defendant, Mrs. Elodie, to be a profoundly selfless act of a parent seeking closure, the court hereby issues a permanent, non-contact, financial restraining order against the plaintiff, Kian, as requested by the defendant. Case closed. I looked at Kian one last time. He was slumped in his chair, defeated, not by the law, but by my final, undeniable act of independence. The moment the judge's gavel hit the block, Kian exploded. He didn't shout at the judge. He turned his pure, raw fury on me. "You manipulative bitch!" he screamed, the profanity echoing off the marble walls. "You think you won? I'm free of you. I don't need your money or your pity. You're the one who will die alone." The bailiffs were already moving toward him, their hands on his arms, but he struggled, his face contorted in a terrifying mask of pure hatred. "I'll never call you again. You hear me? I will never, ever need you." I stood still, letting his venom wash over me, a final, necessary cleansing. The words, which a year ago would have shattered me, now felt hollow and pathetic. He was right. He was free of me. But the profound irony was that I was finally, truly free of him. Mr. Peterson placed a gentle hand on my arm and steered me toward the back exit. As we were leaving, I heard the final, desperate, broken sound from the courtroom. The distinct, wet sound of Kian finally sobbing. Not the performative, guilt-tripping tears, but the raw, helpless sobs of a man who had finally lost his ultimate security blanket. It was the last sound I ever heard from him. 2 weeks later, the day before my flight to Acadia, I received one final piece of communication. It wasn't an email, a text, or a call. It was a small, unmarked box delivered to my porch. Inside, nestled in shredded tissue paper, was the Leica camera. Not the one from the estate sale, which had long been sold, but the professional Nikon I had let him take. The one he'd claimed was too old, but had sold to get his cash. Inside the box was also a handwritten note, folded neatly into a square. The handwriting was Kian's, but it was shaky and small. It simply read, "The only thing I ever needed was your belief. I'll make my own way now. Don't call me." The note was a complex final twist of the knife. It was an admission of defeat, a half-hearted attempt at dignity, and a final, manipulative demand wrapped into one. He was still trying to control the narrative, to frame himself as the rejected artist who was now bravely going to face the world alone. He wasn't apologizing for the betrayal, the lies, or the lawsuit. He was simply telling me, one last time, that my lack of belief was the cause of all his problems. I looked at the note, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no pity. The well of my emotion for him was completely dry. I was at peace. I placed the camera on my kitchen counter and walked to my bedroom to finish packing. Reese called, his voice lighter and more genuinely happy than I had heard in years. He didn't ask about Kian. He asked about my trip. "The weather is going to be perfect in Acadia, Elodie," he said. "The fall colors are peaking." We talked for a few minutes, not as ex-spouses, but as two people who had just survived a war together. As we were about to hang up, Reese hesitated. "Elodie," he said softly, "I'm proud of you. I always knew you had this strength. Now go live your life." The unexpected validation, the honest, unburdened love in his voice was more valuable than any sum of money. That night, I opened the safe I kept in my closet and pulled out the only thing Kian had ever given me that I truly treasured. A small, smooth river stone he had found for me on a camping trip when he was 8, claiming it held all his childhood wishes for me. I placed it next to the camera and the note. It was a physical representation of the past. The innocence, the betrayal, and the final, clean break. I knew that Kian was out there, struggling, learning a terrible lesson he should have learned years ago. But his fate was no longer my responsibility. My responsibility was to the woman in the mirror, the woman who had fought for her dignity and won. The time for revenge was over. The time for my life was finally beginning. I woke up to a profound, deep silence. It wasn't the anxious silence of waiting for a manipulative phone call. It was the natural, pristine silence of a crisp dawn on the coast of Maine. I was nestled in a small, rustic cabin on the edge of Acadia National Park. It was the 3rd morning of my solo trip, and today was the day I was finally going to hike up to Cadillac Mountain to watch the sunrise, a dream I had held for 30 years. I dressed quickly, pulling on warm layers, and grabbed my camera. Not the Nikon Kian had returned, but a simple point-and-shoot I had bought for myself. I didn't need a fancy camera to see the world. I just needed my own eyes. I drove the winding mountain road in the pre-dawn darkness, the headlights cutting through a faint, misty fog. When I reached the summit, I was one of the first people there. I found a quiet spot near the edge of the granite outcrop, took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, and waited. The world was a canvas of gray and deep blue, silent and expectant. I pulled the small river stone Kian had given me out of my pocket and held it, turning it over in my palm. The memory of the little boy who had given it to me was clear, but the pain was gone. The stone no longer represented a burden of expectation. It represented a memory I could acknowledge and gently set down. I walked to the very edge of the mountain, and with a silent prayer for his eventual peace, I tossed the stone over the side. It was a final symbolic letting go of the son who was and the son who never was. As I walked back to my spot, I saw a familiar figure standing by a park bench, his back to me. It was Reese. He turned at the sound of my footsteps and smiled, a wide, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I know this is your trip, Elodie," he said, walking towards me. "But I couldn't miss the sunrise. It's the first one in 20 years where I haven't been worried about something Kian was doing." He didn't ask how he knew I was there. The answer was obvious. We knew each other's quiet dreams. We stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the eastern horizon. The light began as a thin, brilliant orange line, a fire against the deep indigo sky. It rose slowly, painting the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean in hues of gold and rose. The thousands of tiny islands, the dark, pine-covered mountains, and the deep blue water were revealed in a silent, spectacular burst of light. It was breathtaking, a moment of pure, unadulterated beauty that needed no audience, no applause, no manipulation. It was simply real. I turned to Reese, my eyes wet with a sudden, overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered, the word inadequate for all he had done. "Not for the money or the lawyer, for the courage." Reese reached for my hand, his grip warm and firm. "We're a team, Elodie. We always were. We just forgot for a while." He didn't say, "Let's get back together." He didn't need to. In that moment, looking at the sunrise we had both dreamed of seeing decades ago, we were simply two honest adults, free of the shadow that had darkened our lives. The healing was complete. I had not just saved my money, I had saved my life. I had traded a life of fear for a moment of quiet, powerful, unforgettable freedom. I looked back at the sunrise, pulling my camera up to capture the moment. The photograph I took wasn't for a portfolio. It wasn't for social media. It was just for me. It was a picture of a new beginning, a testament to the strength I never knew I had. My revenge was not Kian's downfall. It was the beauty of my own reclaimed life. As the sun crested the horizon, washing the entire world in golden light, I knew that no matter what happened next, I was finally, truly, and happily my own. Have you ever struggled with an adult child who relied on you financially, even when they should have been independent? Share your thoughts, advice, and personal stories in the comments. Thank you for listening to my story. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more tales of family betrayal.